So on to our first panel. I'll introduce the panelists. Laura Kelley is an adjunct faculty member in the history department at Tulane University and is the author of The Irish in New Orleans, a well-researched volume that covers all aspects of the Irish in the city, from 18th century Governor Alejandro O'Reilly to the Irish-dominated politics of the 20th century. Justin Nystrom is an associate professor of history at Loyola University, where he also directs the Center for the Study of New Orleans and the Documentary and Oral History Studio. He's the author of New Orleans After the Civil War, Race, Politics, and a New Birth of Freedom. And his forthcoming book is entitled Creole Italian, Sicilian Immigrants and the Shaping of New Orleans Food Culture. And finally, Daniel Hammer is the Deputy Director of the Historic New Orleans Collection. If you've been attending other days of this event, you've seen him already. And there he has worked closely over the years with the institution's significant holdings relating to the history of the German community in New Orleans. I'd also like to note, before I turn it over to the panelists, that all of them will be giving extended presentations of their work at the Louisiana Historical Association annual meeting here in New Orleans next month, and there's information out there on the tables about the LHA meeting. So let's have our first panel.
Well, thank you for everybody for being here. I was well, how many people are going to come on a Sunday morning? It looks like it's going to pour, and the answer is quite a few. And I'll just housekeepingly forgive this congestion. I'll hopefully not be coughing shortly. What we're going to do today is each of us are going to take a little bit of time and talk a little bit about our different research areas briefly. But what we want this to be is more of a flowing conversation about where we are as a historical community, talking about immigration history and some of the themes that we're going to be looking at in the future. And before I start, I guess I want each of us to kind of say what we because you talk about Italians, you talk about the Irish, and you talk about the Germans, and they're sort of the cartoon version of the ethnic history. And so for Italians, of course, it's the muffaletta in the mafia, right? And so for the Irish, Kelley, what would you say?
Oh, the Fighting Irish, involving lots of alcohol. So definitely red hair, whiskey, and a fist in the air, I think, occasionally, if not in the face.
Daniel?
Beer.
Beer, yeah. And more beer.
Some mythologies die hard, for sure.
Well, they're true.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's the thing about cliches, they're true, So, just a little bit of background. So my work is on Sicilians, but chronologically that comes last. And so chronologically we need to start with Daniel and the Germans and move on to the Irish, and I will go last. So Daniel, if you'd like to lead us off.
Great, thank you. And thanks everybody for being here and for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I have a little bit of insecurity. I'm a little bit insecure because I don't consider myself a historian, but I feel that it's very appropriate that I have worked with the German history of this region as an archivist, and that's why I'm sitting here today, because truly, if there's one thing that's the most remarkable thing about the history of Germans in New Orleans, it's the record that is left of that history, which is truly a unique collection of materials in this country as it relates to the history of German Americans. And so what I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes telling you about that material that we have at the Historic New Orleans Collection and what it says about the German experience in New Orleans. The oldest piece of paper in our collection at the Historic New Orleans Collection, a collection of materials that numbers greater than 1 million objects, has a connection to Germanness. It's a map of the Atlantic world by a man named Martin Waldseemüller from the year 1513, so 21 years after Columbus landed on Hispaniola. and it shows the Gulf of Mexico, something that had, before this map was produced, not previously been indicated on a printed map. And so it's a quite remarkable document. And Waldseemüller was a very important map maker. He also produced a map of the world that was perhaps the most important map of his time. And he was not someone that we would today call a German, but certainly a German-speaking person. And so this speaks to the importance of the German language in the Atlantic world around the time of the formation of Louisiana and the early days of the Louisiana colony, in the important task of communicating the idea of Louisiana around the European world at that time. Another incredible object, one of my favorite objects in our collection, is a piece of propaganda from the year 1720, so 2 years after New Orleans was founded in 1718. And it's a pamphlet, it's in German, and it describes Louisiana from New Canada down the Mississippi out into the Gulf, and all of the opportunities that it presented for riches. And it's it's mostly translated from French documentation of Louisiana from that time period, but it is printed in Leipzig in 1720. Now, Leipzig was a place where trading crossroads met. The road from Paris to Riga and the road from Bergen to Rome met in Leipzig. And so the east-west and north-south trade in Europe really was centered very much in this place, and it was here that this document about Louisiana was printed in order to spread the word of Louisiana around Central Europe in the dominant language of that place, German. And the main purpose of this, of course, was to encourage people to buy shares in the Company of the Indies. And so already in this very early period, you see German language playing a very important role in creating a picture of Louisiana in the minds of Europeans. Now, famously, there were German-speaking people who came to Louisiana at that time as well. There was a settlement of Germans upriver from New Orleans that was established in 1720, and about 300 people settled there. We know this from census records that the French took at that time, that this population numbered about 300 German-speaking people. We know from ship's passenger lists and documentation of people who left their home places in German-speaking lands of South Central Europe that probably about 10 times that number of people left trying to come to Louisiana. So thousands of these people died on their way, and eventually a few hundred of them settled, but they were a very successful colony of people, and they quite famously sustained New Orleans during the early period of the city's establishment. Now, there wasn't much in the way of German immigration to this region following this single influx of people. And you see this group of people become very much local. You know, they established themselves upriver from New Orleans. They were successful. They, we tend to say, assimilated to the French Creole culture of the time. But, you know, 300 people upriver from New Orleans, this was a big group of people relative to the total number of Europeans who were in the region at the time, a region which was generally describable, I think, as a vast wilderness. And so there's quite a bit of exploring yet to do, really, in the impact that these German-speaking people had in the development of the kind of European culture that we came to call Louisiana French Creole culture. And so there are some scholars who work in that field and explore that today. Now, in the early 19th century, you begin to see immigrants arriving as New Orleans becomes American, and as the people who were fleeing the Rhine River Valley region and the Europe that was, besieged by, I guess you could say, the Napoleonic Wars and whatnot. You begin to see many German-speaking people coming to the United States, and Louisiana, New Orleans was part of that. And so you see modest number of people coming here and establishing themselves. And I guess the thing that I want to point out about this group of people that came to New Orleans in the early 19th century is that they were mostly either people who were of relatively substantial means and were able to connect with relatives and people who were established here and conduct business, or they were people who came as indentured servants. We have quite a few interesting documents of indenture from the very early 19th century showing German people coming here and basically selling their services to people for a period of usually 3 years in order to pay for their passage over here. Then in the, and I'm going to try to really summarize this quickly, beginning in 1819, the United States begins documenting who's coming, and you begin to see records of ships coming with immigrants, and the record keeping then really picks up, and you see the growth of the German mass immigration. We have a wonderful document in our collection, a book that was written by a young man who came here to connect with his uncle, so a man of means who came and established a business connection, and he joined his uncle in St. Francisville and became a very successful business person. He was from Ulm, which is a town in Germany, and he writes a description in 1828 of going to New Orleans to conduct business and seeing there a ship full of German-speaking immigrants unloading on the docks. It's July, the river is high, the city is a mess. He describes it as being very filthy, and that the enslaved laborers and other laborers are working on the levees trying to reinforce them, and so the rest of the care of the city is kind of secondary to that, so it's very dirty, and these many immigrants in this boat have been unloaded on the docks, and they're destitute, and they have nowhere to go, and they're going to fall, surely, he writes, as the first victims of yellow fever. And so you see in this document two very different experiences. His experiences, which was one of privilege and means, and their experience, which is one of desperation. And as you go into the 19th century, you begin to get more and more information about the German immigrant experience because, very importantly, the German Society of New Orleans is established in 1847, and they begin to work to help indigent German immigrants arriving in the city, mostly to find their way on to their points of where they want to go, which is mostly the Midwest, but also in some cases to help them establish themselves in the city. And 1854 is the peak year of German immigration to New Orleans, and this coincides with the yellow fever epidemic of 1853 when many German-speaking people, Germans, died. And so I think that the German population of New Orleans was actually, although it was quite significant, probably would have been larger had it not been for the disease and things like that. And most German people did not stay in New Orleans, but rather continued on. But the German Society of New Orleans was very important because they kept a record of everything that they did, and we still have that record today thanks to the work of the society at the end of the 19th century, and particularly of the president of the society in the 1890s, J. Hanno Deiler, who was very interested in local German history and wrote a number of pamphlets about the history of the German community, and he established an archive committee of the German Society of New Orleans, and he saw to it that their records were retained. And so what we have today is the records of this group dating back to 1847 in basically complete form. In addition to that, other German groups that were existing in New Orleans at the time, musical societies, small benevolent organizations, and things like that, the German society eventually collected their records as these groups ceased to exist, and members would bring their records to the society. So by the 1920s, the few remaining German groups of the 19th century that were still around in New Orleans they got together and formed a group called Deutsches Haus. And the German Society was the largest of these groups, but there was also a gymnastic organization called the Turnverein and a singing organization called the Harugari Männerchor. And these groups had all compiled records of other organizations. And so the Deutsches Haus became the caretaker of this material, and they didn't throw it away, remarkably, because around the country, groups like Deutsches Haus did throw these records away. And today, in the 1980s, they saw fit to give this material to the Historic New Orleans collection, and now we have it as this remarkable resource for the study of the German-American experience, a resource that doesn't exist in other communities which are much better known as German places, the cities of the Midwest and the Eastern Seaboard and whatnot. The one exception being, I think, Philadelphia, where the German Society of Pennsylvania's records are still intact. But to sum it up, I want to just kind of underscore that we have this complete record, or not complete, but extensive record of experiences of German-speaking people in this place from the earliest time to the present day. It's a record that continues to be produced. But if you wanted to draw some sort of connection between a German New Orleanian who's documented as a member of Deutsches Haus in the 1950s and a German immigrant who came here in the 1850s, or if you wanted to draw a connection between a member of the German Society of New Orleans from the 1870s and a member of this colony of the German coast from the 1720s, I think it would be extremely difficult to find ways to compare these people to one another. Yes, they're all German-speaking people, but that's basically, in most cases, where the comparison stops. But in each of these cases, you can find important information about the experience of coming to this country, about the immigrant experience. And then after the people came here as immigrants, they became people who called this place home. They became residents, and they interacted with their fellow residents. And this German record that we have here in New Orleans documents this. And so truly, it shows us what the American experience is in New Orleans, more so than any other resource, perhaps. And I think that this is an important lesson, that the documentation of the immigrant experience tells us, perhaps better than anything else, who we are, no matter who we are. You don't need to be German to find significance in the German-American experience in New Orleans as documented in the historic record.
Okay. Thank you. Let me take a moment and reiterate what Molly was saying, and thanking everybody for coming here, thanking the program committee, thanking Priscilla and everybody who put together this amazing program and made it available free and open to the public. I also wanted to reiterate what Molly had said about the Louisiana Historical Association and their conference in a month's time from April 12th through the 15th, because it's going to be 3 days of different panels exploring all different types of topics about Louisiana history, and including an entire panel on German. So if you do want to hear a solid 45 minutes of different aspects from 3 different speakers, that will be available, as well as other different immigrant groups, Creole, from contemporary to the past. So please pick up one of those flyers out there, because it's another great opportunity in April to come out and hear and learn more about the city. And also, not related to immigrants at all, but on Wednesday, the New Orleans Center for the Gulf South is putting on a symposium, also free and open to the public, entitled Indigenous Spaces, French Expectations, Exchanges Between Native and Non-Native Peoples of Louisiana, with a real focus just on the Native American community, both in historical, archaeological sense, but also in a contemporary sense, because of course Native American peoples and tribes still exist today. It's not a thing of the past, and they're here in Louisiana and many of them live on the front lines of coastal erosion, and so what happens in their communities affect all of us. So there's also a flyer for that, for anybody who's interested. Irish New Orleans, who knew, right? People have all heard the Irish Channel, and some of you probably have heard about the whole New Basin Canal, legend, myth. But really, New Orleans, the Irish, it's not those two things that you put together. New York, yes, Boston, yes, but not New Orleans, not the South. And I was really pleased to be invited and to speak today about the Irish, but this panel in particular, because we think of New Orleans as being a Creole city and not an immigrant city. And I think almost all of us up here would probably argue the contrary. I think New Orleans is much more an immigrant city, or at least that's a very important factor of its identity, not its identity, of its composition, but not its identity, and we are trying to correct that record. You know, tens of thousands of immigrants, Irish among them, arrived in New Orleans and called it home, both in the past, but also to this present day. And I was excited to hear Molly speak about this new project that they're putting on, because of course New Orleans added a whole nother layer of different immigrant groups post-Katrina that's added yet another dimension to the city's history. New Orleans was a port city, is a port city. We have a tendency to think of the port as being in terms of commerce, but not necessarily in terms of people. And in that respect, New Orleans has a lot in common with New York City, but New Orleans, of course, is also a southern city with its own Catholic heritage and its own Catholic colonial, rulers, the French, the Spanish, and in being a southern city makes it complicated. And I think that's probably something we can all agree upon, is that New Orleans is complicated. I like to say that the Irish arrived with a really large bang, with Alejandro O'Reilly arriving, unloading 2,000 soldiers onto what's now Jackson Square, and the guns going off and the cannons going off. But the truth is that they were here much earlier. They were here at the founding of the city. And the Irish that were here then came with the French military. They also came with, as people looking for an opportunity, as one does, moving to a colony, but they came via France, or they came via Spain. They didn't come directly from Ireland. And this immediately sets it off and makes it different than the Irish experience in what's 13 colonies, because they're coming directly from Ireland, and they're primarily Protestant, while the ones coming here were coming via France and Spain, and were Catholic. So we have different groups of Irish arriving in North America for different reasons, but at the same time. They come through these colonial periods, and of course we only have a very short, limited amount of time, so I can't discuss them in detail. But one thing that I would like to put out there and have you think about this is that when does a group of random individuals who happen to be Irish become a community? And one of the things that Daniel was speaking to was this idea that we get different immigrant, or he's, as he I think correctly says, German-speaking groups, because that's speaking to that diversity. If you come from Bavaria, or if you're coming from Prussia, if you're coming from different parts, you don't necessarily see yourself having something in common with those other regions. And so when does this random group of individuals who happen to be Irish become a community? And one of the ways that we gauge that is we look at sort of ethnic markers, 4 ethnic markers in particular. And one is, when do you have a public celebration of a holiday, or Saints' Day, that is strongly associated with your particular immigrant group? And again, I would like to thank the program committee for arranging this to happen with St. Patrick's Day occurring a couple of days from now, and also St. Joseph's Day happening as well. So, and I'm sure if we dug a little bit harder, we'd find a German holiday that would happen in this week as well.
Or at least some Germans drinking beer somewhere.
There's Germans drinking beer somewhere, exactly. So St. Patrick's Day, so you have this public celebration of something that's associated with the particular immigrant group. And the one in New Orleans happens very early on, documented. I'm sure it actually happened sooner, but documented in the newspapers, and it's in 1806. So, Louisiana Purchase happens in 1803, and this is just a couple of years later. And it was in the paper. Governor Claiborne was there, judges were there, lots of politicians, and what I love was the 21 traditional toasts were also published in the newspaper, and I have them reproduced in my book. So if you want to be very authentic on St. Patrick's Day, you too can try the 21 traditional toasts. Which makes that even funnier is that every year there were different traditional toasts. So I'm never quite sure if they went back to the original one, if you're getting up to 41, 42, or what's happening. Another ethnic marker was the formation of a militia. So at a time when we didn't have a large standing army, towns, cities formed their own militias. They were also, kind of the original boys' club. You got to design your own outfit, you got to practice marches, you got to get together and drink. Again, I think that is actually one of the common themes between our three immigrant groups is the prevalence of alcohol. And probably why they settled so well in New Orleans. And so the Republican Greens form, and they fight in the War of 1812. So that's another marker that tells us these are people who are identifying as Irish. Republican Greens means they're fighting for a free and independent Ireland. It was perfect for them because, of course, who were we fighting in the War of 1812 but Britain? And Britain is the great enemy of the, certainly the Catholic Irish population. Another marker is when you have a charitable organization. And there we get the Hibernian Society in 1819. And this leads to what are the push and pull factors. So what immigrant historians do is you look at the reasons why a particular group leaves their country and why they settle in a place. In other words, what's the push out and what is the pull here or to other parts of the world or North America or wherever that they're settling in communities. And they change over time. And they change over time for the Irish, they change over time for the Germans, and as well as for the Italians. 1819 saw typhus, saw agricultural crisis, and saw a poor Irish immigrant group, primarily male, coming to North America and helping to build what is then the transportation network, digging the canals, hewing out roads, and creating, helping to create these pathways, literally, in America. And they come to New Orleans. The final marker is the church, right? So when do we get the church that is associated with your particular immigrant group? And New Orleans, for all we speak about, especially in the colonial period and its Catholic heritage, just had St. Louis Cathedral, the Ursulines had their chaplain, and it's really the Irish, and they come in and they build St. Patrick's on Camp Street. And it is St. Patrick's, right? Do we need to say anything else? It was English speaking. And what that tells me as a historian is that by this period, we have a cohesive Irish community, and one that built up over time. If we look at our 1806 St. Patrick's Day, up to that period, it's come together, they're identifying, they're doing charitable work, and they're working together. And this is important because, of course, the massive push of Irish immigrants that come to the city and come to North America is due to the famine. And the famine was from 1845 to 1852. But there was already an existing community here. There was one that they built upon. And they changed the face of the city. They built different churches. They built St. Alphonsus in the Irish Channel, St. John the Baptist. I always say if you want to know where the Irish community, existed, look and find the church. And what's interesting is if you stand on top of the Ogden, if there wasn't a wall behind you, you'd have St. Patrick's a couple of blocks behind you. And from that top of the Ogden, you can actually see St. John the Baptist, St. Teresa's of Avila, St. Alphonsus, and it gives you a sense of actually how close and yet distinct these different Irish communities were, and along the river, because they're working in the river, and they're building their homes there, and of course, their schools. Finally, everything is here. New Orleans is the second largest port in America, and then it's the age of sail, and then the Civil War happens, and Irish immigration to the city trickles to a drip, and really, in some ways, that's where the story should stop, and this is what makes New Orleans a fascinating place to study immigrant populations, because it doesn't stop. The Irish don't assimilate. In fact, if anything, Irish identity coheres and strengthens. And in the 1870s, you see the formation of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. You have Hibernia Bank, which was in existence until 2005. You see them become the theme of Comus in 1881. And they enter into politics. We start to get the mayors and all these different layers of politics, and it takes us into the 20th century. And one of the fascinating things to read about is from the WPA records from the late 1930s and 1940s. They went into the Irish Channel and they interviewed they went house to house interviewing people, was how strong people identified as Irish, when there hadn't been a drop of Irish blood in that neighborhood in a long time. And normally for immigrant historians, you need a replenishing of the well. You need people to be coming in to reinforce that Irish identity. And it's not happening in the sense that the new immigrants coming in, but the Irish identity is very strong. And that's a sort of a question to think about. So it continues, and we get the Uptown parades and get other different things that happen in the 20th century and continue with this Irish identity here. One of the things with my book, and that I'll end on, is that I normally deal with dead people, right? Dead people, they have their advantages, they don't talk back. They have their disadvantages, they don't talk back. So you're dealing in the archives a lot. But in my book, I really wanted to bring everything to the present day. And so I found myself interviewing a lot of Irish-born people who live in New Orleans, and they come from a range of backgrounds, from lawyers and teachers to bartenders to construction workers, business owners. And I asked them a simple question. I said, why New Orleans? Some of them had come here directly from Ireland. Some of them had lived in New York for 15 years and then moved to New Orleans. So they had a variety of different backgrounds, both economic as well as how long they'd been in the city or how long they'd been outside of Ireland. And what struck me is that their answer was almost the same. It was quite uniform. And it was summed up by Pauline Patterson, who said, when she wakes up in the morning and she hears the church bells ring, and when people stop and talk to each other on the street, and that when community and family and friendship is more important than necessarily going to work on time, that the getting together, that it reminded them of home. It reminded them of Ireland. It reminded them of the place that they had to leave, many of them looking for economic opportunity. And in New Orleans, they found that. They found literally the sounds, the movement, the people, the sense of community. And if they couldn't be in Ireland, New Orleans was the second best thing. Thank you.
I'll say, Laura, I was in Cork, Ireland last summer, and it did, in fact, remind me a lot of New Orleans. In fact, a lot of street signs were missing, and they were unpronounceable.
Yes.
So, a quick, very brief plug. We have a daughter of the Irish Channel being honored, along with Leah Chase, one of our great Creoles, tomorrow night at Loyola at Roussel. 6:30 reception, 7:30 program called Open Kitchens, Women Changing the New Orleans Food Scene. And so we got a great panel of women chefs, and it'll be fun. So, when I talk to my students about immigration in the 19th century in New Orleans, when I take them out, I like to bring them to Lafayette Square, and there's a little marker in Lafayette Square where Louis Kossuth, the Hungarian radical, spoke in the 1850s. He was making this tour of American cities to rally support. Of course, Europe is in turmoil about a lot of different changes in terms of radical politics. And, I try to paint the scene of what the crowd might have looked like. And you got to remember, in the middle of the 19th century, almost half of New Orleans was foreign born. It was very much an immigrant city. A lot of people speaking German, Gaelic, Italian, all the varieties of Dutch and whatnot, and of course French and Spanish. New Orleans was intensely polyglot. And, I think the author who in many ways gets it the best, strangely, is Herbert Asbury's French Quarter, in talking about those mid-19th century. I always actually show a clip from Gangs of New York in my class, because I like to think about you know, the sort of flavor of that really transitional time in American urban culture. You know, when you think about Sicilians, a lot of times the picture in your mind is of one of those famous Louis Hind photographs where it's, you know, the Sicilian peasant family with everything they own on their back, coming in on a steamer at the turn of the century, and they're kind of staring back with you, and it's like a grim future, a grim past. But the Sicilian migration, not just to New Orleans, and when we're talking about Italians, we're really talking about Sicilians, generally speaking, in New Orleans. And yeah, there are token Italians who come in earlier, but that's not what I'm here to talk to you about. I'm talking about sort of larger historical process. But the reality is that Sicilians start coming in meaningful numbers really in the 1830s. There are two migrations of Sicilians, and it's important to understand this because it explains why Sicilians are here in the first place. It has a lot to do with lemons. Yeah. So Sicily, so I was writing this book that's coming out, and I read all this horticultural literature about lemons because they're really interesting. And I'd be writing along, and my wife works at home, and I go, did you know? And she's like, this is about lemons, isn't it? And I said, how did you know? But lemons were the ideal produce in the age of sail because you could pick them rock hard and green and you'd wrap them and you could put them in a boat which might take 110 days. 110 days to get from Palermo to New Orleans because of the way, if you look at the Gulf Stream, there's no direct route, right? It's not until you have steam. So the Sicilian traders, Sicily was the world's leading producer of lemons in the middle of the 19th century. In fact, it's not eclipsed by California until 1938. And so Sicily lemons start coming into New Orleans, Boston, Baltimore, and of course here in the 1830s really, and they start being traded on the levee, and you start to see these Louisiana, Sicilian citrus merchants making regular voyages across the Atlantic. But of course, because it takes so long, they're not bringing a bunch of immigrants, they're just bringing produce, they're traders. By the time you get to the Civil War, they've developed trading houses, they've branched out, they're importing produce from upstream, they've got oyster saloons, they've got places, the Camarda family who eventually opens up Commander's Palace. They're here with an oyster saloon and other things like that. But you have this relatively small merchant class, and then steam happens. And with steam, the citrus fleet, which is modernized to carry much larger cargoes of citrus, also can finally affordably carry people. And you start to see the great migration of Sicilian immigrants, and they're coming seasonally on the citrus fleet. There's this symbiotic relationship between sugarcane and lemons, because when you want to harvest lemons and put them in a boat, you get here right about time for the zuccherata, which is, you know, the Italian sugar word for the sugar harvest. And so you could actually have seasonally, if you can imagine commuting across the Atlantic to harvest sugarcane. That's how desperate things were in Sicily, because there was no duck. We want duck soup to harvest cane for sure. And so over time, you start to see more and more of these workers stay. They get into lumber camps, they get into levees, they get into railroads, laboring, and eventually truck farming in a big way. So, you know, when we think about this grand historical dynamic, we need to think about the Hennessy assassination a little bit differently, because it's about in the 1890s when the citrus fleet is starting to look elsewhere. If you own a ship, the key to owning a ship is keeping it moving and keeping it full of stuff, because ships that are idle and empty don't make you any money. And so the Sicilian merchants are very sharp. They're moving lemons, they're moving people, and they branch into tropical fruit, which ultimately, as you know, eclipses lemons. And lemons stop coming in because there's a tariff in 1920, and so there's no more lemons coming in. That's why we don't think of them, because we just stop importing them altogether. But it doesn't matter. Bananas are much more profitable anyway. And so you have all these sugar and cotton brokers uptown. They're manacled to these crops. Sugar's going into full-on collapse in the 1890s. Cotton's in a slower decline, but it is a declining concern. And here you have these prosperous Sicilian merchants in the rising trade of tropical fruit and really diversified shipping. They've been smart. They've worked together, and they've really created something. There's a lot of jealousy of what the Sicilians have created. Do Italians murder David Hennessy? You know, I'm going to go with probably. But the point is that the lynching wasn't about so much. I mean, there's a lot written about whiteness and race, and I'm going to tell you why I discount. The Sicilian experience isn't the black experience. I think that's disingenuous. I think in a way, I would even go far as to say it's insulting to the black experience. And here's why. And I don't mean, if you're Sicilian, I don't mean to offend you. The Sicilian struggle is its own struggle. It rained on cue. I'm getting wound up. Can I get an amen? All right. So at the time of the lynching, you have Sicilians who belong to the Southern Yacht Club. Right. You have substantially socially highly regarded Sicilians in New Orleans. The people who die in the Hennessy lynching, it's really kind of a funny mix, because some people walk out of that jail unharmed. It's political. In some degrees, it's personal. The lynch mob does whip up the crowd on this sort of nativist, racialized terms. But as social instruction, it was an absolute failure. The Italians did not bow down. They were not cowed. They were not terrorized systematically like black people were in the wake of Robert Charles. In fact, by the 1900s, flip through the newspaper a little while, you start to see Italians marrying non-Italians. You start to see them appearing in the social pages. You start to see the society reporters showing up to their galas. Italians are becoming accepted at elite levels. And I don't see a parallel. African Americans, if you study the history of African Americans, they don't even show up in the newspaper until our own time, right? So the Sicilians come here in large numbers, and I like to talk about the Sicilians in the context of African Americans because they have a shared story. I one time decided to, as a presentation I gave for the Historic New Orleans Collection's wonderful Purchased Lives exhibit, I did it, and I will say, Erin Greenwald's not here, but she said I would be doing a presentation in Alexandria. And I assumed she meant near Washington, D.C. I didn't know she meant Alexandria, Louisiana. You can be sure the bait and switch I felt was just crushing. If you're from Alexandria, my apologies. But what I did was I was talking about emancipation and the role of emancipation on New Orleans. And for this talk, I decided to go and map all the black Protestant churches that had opened in New Orleans between 1865 and 1900. And I'd already made a map of Sicilians who had bars, who'd been arrested for violating the Gay Shattuck Law, which was a segregationist law passed in 1909 that made it illegal to serve blacks and whites in the same place. And I overlaid the two maps on top of one and each other, and this was a shared experience. The story of African Americans migrating to New Orleans, Protestant, non-Creole African Americans migrating to New Orleans, and the story of Catholic Sicilians, also poor, migrating to New Orleans and filling up these poor neighborhoods, living side by side, drinking together, and ultimately playing music together. Because, of course, the story of jazz is also about African Americans, it's about Creoles, and it's about Italians together. What I start to see is a dynamic. Sicilians are owning the bars and the clubs. They're hiring musicians of color to play in these clubs. And this is a dynamic that continues on. There are many different symbiotic relationships, and I've gone completely off my notes, which is as I always do. And you'll have to forgive me for that. But this goes, I think, about a more modern rendition of this relationship. Many of you in this room knew the great Creole chef Nathaniel Burton. His career was intrinsically part of the Segreto family, my old friend Joe Segreto. Nathaniel Burton, as a young man, worked for Joe Segreto's dad on Bourbon Street. It was his first job, working in a real restaurant that wasn't like a hospital kitchen in 1944. And then he later worked for the Sun at Broussard's, along with Joe Marcello, in the 1970s, right about the time that he and Rudy Lombard put together that amazing book, Creole Feast. There is this really interesting shared relationship between the Sicilians and people of color in New Orleans that I think we need to look at more fully. And with that, I want to transition into talking about immigrants more fully. I mentioned Purchased Lives, and what I thought was so groundbreaking about Purchased Lives was it was philosophical. It was about how we wanted to tell our story. New Orleans has told a similar story for a very long time. And Purchased Lives was, in my view, a courageous and intellectually mature thing for the historic New Orleans collection to do, because it was finally giving us a version of antebellum New Orleans that wasn't nostalgic. It wasn't in the hoop skirt paradigm, right? And so if we think about where we are as a people, as a country right now in 2018, and I'm not even going to use the M word, right? I drove past one of them on my way here. But something is happening right now, and it's larger than just old histories, but the sort of not telling of the immigrant story on the landscape to me is a really important force that needs to change, not just ethnically, but also chronologically. For many years, New Orleans was stuck. I hear you. Give me 5 minutes?
No.
Okay. 5 minutes. So anyway, she said 5 minutes, really. So chronologically, we've been very stuck in the antebellum period. You know, somebody said, well, you know, this is within keeping of the historical nature of the French Quarter. I'm like, what historical nature are you talking about? And I show them a picture of the levee in 1903 with a bunch of people with mules loading cotton, Italian and African-American stevedores in the Jack's Brewery, right? None of that's antebellum, right? Does the French Quarter's historical nature mean 1840? Right? And I think we need to start asking these hard questions. It's time to start interpreting all of our history in New Orleans because we'll be richer for it. And I think since my time is about up, and I said I wasn't going to get carried away to Daniel and Kelley, but one last story. So Hubert Varenhorst, who I interviewed for that Deutsches Haus documentary, told me Camp Leroy Johnson, which interestingly on Google Maps, it still says Camp Leroy Johnson right here, even though Camp Leroy Johnson's been gone a long time, right? How that happens, God only knows. This was a German prisoner of war camp during World War II up here. And he said his dad would break into the prisoner of war camp, play soccer with his buddies who were German prisoner of war, and then go home. You know, believe that if you want. Thanks, everybody.